Steve has introduced three great characters that I hope he will talk a little bit about. One, helming the USS Jamestown's mission was Sea Captain Robert Bennett Forbes, who one historian described as living a life that Hollywood would be likely to turn down as too improbable. Then we have in Ireland, we've got the true hero of the famine, Father Theobald Matthew of Cork County. And then, of course, there's Charles Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary at the British Treasury. He believed the famine was sent by God to teach the Irish a lesson, and it must not be too much mitigated. So, Steve, tell us more about those wonderful three people. And then, if you would, give us a sense as to what drew you into this story.
Sure. Thanks, Joan. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. Glad to be back with the Lexington Historical Society Book Club again. As I think Sue said 6 times in the past, always at the depot, which has been fun. So we hope to have a little fun tonight. And just when we get to questions, just so you know, so we're clear, if you do have one, I love questions and answers. So don't be shy about it. You know, you'll get unmuted to ask. So that'll be great if you're able to do that. I love that part. It's really my favorite part of these events. So I know this is a pretty engaging group and an engaged group, so I'll be looking forward to that. So Voyage of Mercy and the famine itself, I'll say this to Joan's question, how do they get drawn into the famine? I guess half of me backed into it and half of me was really interested in it. So the backing into it was this: I was very excited about the USS Jamestown mission, which I first learned about when I was researching A City So Grand, which is my Boston book about the second half of the 19th century, and just had come across the Jamestown voyage then, devoted a couple pages of it in A City So Grand, but filed it away and said, wow, I have to find out a little bit more about this mission. And, you know, to Ireland, I know 5,000 ships came from Ireland to the United States and Canada, but man, how many ships went the other way with food? That's a really interesting story to me. I need to find out a little bit more about that. And then later, when I turned to it, I'm married into a large Irish family. The famine comes up from time to time. And I said, you know, I did some good research on the Irish in Boston, I think, for A City So Grand. I need to know how the famine affected the Irish and what it means to Irish history and the great Irish immigration. You know, one of the first large immigrations from Western Europe. And so I put those two things together: the Jamestown and the kind of need to know a little bit about Ireland and the Irish people, and dug into the famine. And what I found, I mean, it's an extraordinary story. You think about a famine, and there have been greater famines in the 20th century numerically. That is, more people have died, more people have starved in famines in places like Africa, in Asia, in Russia. But the Irish famine, when you think of the scope on the percentage of the population in Ireland, we're talking about a famine that really affected about 1/3 of the Irish population. So Ireland's population just prior to the famine is a little over 8.5 million people. And when everything is done, the end of the famine years, which some historians put at 1851, some historians put at 1855, whatever that era is, you know, Ireland's population is more like 6 million, even a little under 6 million. So in terms of the percentage of population, it's nearly 30%. It's extraordinary. Ireland still has not come back population-wise. Its population today is smaller than it was pre-famine. So it's one of those things that has affected the country for a long time. We'll talk about different ways that has happened as well. And so we're talking about a period of time, this 1846, summer of 46, which is when the Great Famine hits, right? That's the year. And all the way through 1847 until the early part of 1848. Those are the worst months of the famine. We're talking about a time when about 30% of the Irish population, okay, that 30% number comes up, 30% of the Irish population depended exclusively on potatoes. And so when people talk about the impact of the potato famine, That is again, an extraordinary number of people who depend exclusively on potatoes. And I think we could talk a little bit about why that is as well. In fact, one of the characters that Joan mentioned, Sir Charles Trevelyan, who is the British bureaucrat in charge of managing famine relief for Ireland, which is part of Britain at the time, said, "What hope is there for a nation which relies on potatoes?" And, in his weird kind of bigoted way, he was right during this period. It was a devastating potato blight, a complete failure of the crop in the summer of 46. And this came on the heels of a very poor crop in 1845. And so those two factors together lead to these catastrophic conditions in Ireland very, very quickly. So the blight happens in August of 46. By about November, let's say, people are starving. And the situation in Ireland is very, very bad. And when the calendar turns to 1847, the United States first gets word of this in late January of 1847, really about how bad it was. That's when things kick in here in the United States in this massive relief effort, unprecedented relief effort from one country and one people to another begins. And over the next 16 months, from the Jamestown voyage in March of 47, all the way to about June, late June, early July of 48, the United States sends about 150 ships filled with food to Ireland, contributed largely by the people of the United States, people of all walks of life. So I call this at the beginning of the book in my little author's intro that it's a story of hope and soaring generosity and goodwill amidst the backdrop of really unfathomable despair, what's happening in Ireland. So those two pieces together, as I started to do the research, really made for a very, very compelling story. Joan mentioned some of the characters. Trevelyan is one of them. As I say, he's the bureaucrat responsible for England's really poor job of handling the famine. There's been periods throughout history, through the last 150, 160 years, where England was accused of genocide, which I don't subscribe to. And there's been this change among Irish historians where not many of them subscribe to that either. But I will say that if you kind of look at the way the British handled the famine, it was a combination of incompetence, indifference, impotence, benign neglect, ineptness, anti-Catholicism. All of that leads to the catastrophe. And Trevelyan really is perched on the top of those efforts and bears a large responsibility. He's the real life villain of this book. Even though he's considered a great bureaucrat, a great government administrator, the scope, I think, of the famine is so vast that he doesn't grasp it, and virtually nobody in London grasps how bad it is, despite the pleas from Father Matthew, Theobald Matthew, who is the Irish priest, who's right in the center of this famine in Cork City, among the worst places in Ireland for the famine at the time, who is pleading with Trevelyan. And for those of you who've read the book, you know that he's writing to Trevelyan often, begging for relief. Father Matthew is this incredibly compelling character. He is the poor man's priest. He developed his reputation, which was international at this point, even though he hadn't been outside of Ireland, for his crusade against drunkenness, his temperance crusade, his anti-drinking crusade, where hundreds of thousands of Irish signed up for this in the 1830s. Father Matthew felt that liquor and alcoholism had proven devastating to the Irish people, and so led this crusade that became internationally famous, and particularly, I'd say, in Europe, famous. So he was most known for that. He was known among the people of Ireland for the way he responded to previous cholera epidemics, Getting right into hospitals, getting into fever sheds, helping those who had cholera with food and with medicine and things like that. And so when the famine starts, it was his natural inclination, I think, to do the same kind of thing for these peasants. And so these poor Irish turned to Father Matthew for food, for money, for lodging in his home, literally in Cork. Father Matthew starts an Irish cemetery, a Catholic cemetery at his parish to bury the dead that starve during this famine. And he really becomes, I think, the leader on the Irish side in begging the British for help and the kind of help that they need. So really compelling character, and one of those priests who, would take confessions at 5 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock at night because his parishioners worked in the fields or were common laborers and had no other time to get to see him. And he really developed that reputation, was beloved among the Irish people for that. And then there's Captain Forbes, Robert Bennett Forbes, third character that Joan mentions, who is the captain of the USS Jamestown, the first ship to go in the other direction, laden down with food as part of this massive American effort to help the Irish. Forbes, he does have a Hollywood kind of existence. He makes his first transatlantic voyage at the age of 6 with his mother when they go across the ocean in search of Forbes's father, who's kind of a ne'er-do-well, who's supposed to be over in Europe earning money for the family and, hasn't really gotten that done. So the mother finally says to her two children, including Robert Bennett Forbes, let's go. We're crossing the ocean. They become involved essentially in the midst of the War of 1812. The ship gets detained, long story. They get detained in France for a little while. They finally connect with the father. Forbes is away from the ages of 6 to the age of 9, comes back. At the age of 13, he's a cabin boy on a ship to China. And at the age of 20, he's the commander, he's the captain of a ship involved in the opium trade in China at the young age of 20. He probably logs more miles at sea than almost anybody else in this time period, American or otherwise. There's a period of 10 years from his age of 17 to 27 when he says, I think I've probably spent about 6 months on land during this period because he's at sea so often. Becomes a millionaire by the age of 30, loses it all by the age of 33 or right around 33, gets married when he's 34, and then goes to China again, leaves his wife with their 8-month-old. And this is after the couple had lost 2 other children, but leaves for 2 years, 1838 to 1840, to try to make a living and kind of rebuild his wealth in China, which he does. And those 2-year period, very, very difficult for both him, his wife Rose. The two exchange these incredible letters during that 2-year gap that really tells you a lot about the character of both of them. When he gets back, his wife essentially says, you're going to have to stay home for a little while. He agrees. They have a couple more children. He's enjoying, I'd say, his home life, the Boston life. He's a shipbuilder. He sells ships. He's got a business of his own. And in 1847, when he gets word of what's happening with the famine, he volunteers to command this first ship, the USS Jamestown. And when asked why, he says, it is not an everyday matter to see a nation starving. And so he kind of takes the lead, becomes this real hero to the Irish, and launches this American effort to, bring food and supplies to Ireland. So that's my long answer, Joan, to your first question. I just wanted to kind of set that whole stage for your others.
That's great. The one thing I want to maybe have you talk about, if you will, in your research, as you were actually looking at the information about the ship, do you think the Jamestown, do you feel like it was going to make it? I mean, the crew and the ship itself, do you think it was destined to fail? Weren't you surprised that it made it?
Well, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Jamestown. I think it's good. It's a good way to get into this overall effort, right? So the Jamestown is a warship initially, and the U.S. Congress, for the first time ever, unprecedented, decides to decommission the warship and commission another warship in New York, the USS Macedonian, which takes a lot longer for their voyage to happen, to decommission them and turn them into ships of mercy, if you will, for the famine. For the most part, most other ships, a lot of ships are at war as part of the Mexican War. The United States is in the midst of it at that point. So these ships get refurbished, their deck guns get removed. And as Joan points out, many of the experienced sailors are on ships in the Navy, are part of this effort during the war. So Forbes does enlist the aid of about 2 or 3 experienced captains as his officers for the cruise, for the voyage, but then has to put together this ragtag bunch of people. And in the records, the letters, there are dozens and dozens of letters from people who say, I have no experience at sea, but I could go along as a cook, or I have no experience as a sailor, but I could go along to keep the ship's books. I'm an accountant. But Forbes picks as many of these as he can, and as many people as he can put together, and essentially trains them. It's a very inexperienced crew, to Joan's point. And in the first 8 or 9 days of the voyage, they hit incredibly bad weather, wind, ice, all of that. And so really it's Forbes that gets them through, Joan, to your question. As you're reading through his deck logs, yeah, there's periods when you're wondering if they're going to make it. And they're bailing out. The ship has a little bit of a leak at one point that they need to bail out. So there's all kinds of harrowing things that happen, although they do end up getting to Ireland in about 3 weeks, just under 3 weeks. Not bad. Forbes is really proud of his effort when he gets into Cove, into Cork Harbor, and then he eventually meets Father Matthew as part of this effort.
So now that you mentioned the Macedonia, I have to say that there is another Boston connection, which the group may not know about. When I'm doing North End tours and I'm standing at Paul Revere's house and I'm in North Square, on the other side, looking away from the house, is the Sacred Heart Church. And that was the formal Seaman's Bethel of Father Taylor. So can you tell us a little bit about his story?
Yep.
And you gave me a new story to talk about, so thank you. And his connection to the Macedonia, which I was surprised to hear.
Yeah, so Father Taylor was really known as the fisherman's priest, right? So, or the mariner's priest. He's right across from the mariner's house at the north end too, as well, Joan points out. But he had one of these, I'll say, practices where people came from all around to hear him speak. Emerson goes to hear him speak. Dickens, I think, eventually gets down to hear him speak because he's considered, again, the people's priest, and one of the priests who can really make the scripture come alive for fishermen. And that's the kind of popularity he has. He's quite famous at the time.
And he really couldn't speak. He didn't. He wasn't very well educated, right? He could barely write.
No, he was not.
Yeah,
He could read, I think, but he wasn't a great writer, and he was, I'd say, self-educated, maybe is a way to say it, right? Not as opposed to formally educated. And so when the Macedonian mission is in trouble, it happens a few months after the Jamestown. There's all kinds of bureaucratic issues that happen in New York. The captain of the Macedonian, George Decay, is just really distraught over this because they can't really fill the ship. There's some turf battles between the original relief committee and the Macedonian effort. So what happens is the Boston Relief Committee makes a decision to help out with the support of some congressmen. And so Robert Bennett Forbes goes down there with a team to help put that mission together. And they finally do get it together. I think the ship sails in June of 1847, late June of 1847. And Father Taylor is asked to accompany the voyage and serve really as a priest and as somebody to keep watch of how the voyage goes, the money, the food, all of that kind of thing. So he's probably the first time a priest has had that dual role. So Father Taylor adopts that.
So any questions now from our group? Please feel free to. Steve loves questions. So fire away, gang. I'll leave it up to you now for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And if anyone is having problems with the doodads on the bottom, feel free to actually raise your hand like Mary is. Mary, I saw your hand first. You want to go ahead?
Unmute yourself, Mary. Unmute.
I'm clicking the button, but nothing is happening.
There you go.
Okay, Steve, I want to thank you not only for telling a great story, but how you told it. I love the alliteration in the writing. I am onto a thing with topic sentences, and you have the most fantastic topic sentences that flow from the end of one paragraph to the beginning of another. And I was particularly intrigued.
Thank you.
I know that takes days and days of work. And I was particularly intrigued with all your sources about the weather. I've been trying to track down the weather, and every time you mentioned the weather, I thought, darn it all, where did he find that? And so if you could speak a little to your research, which papers were most valuable, where you found all those weather details and other items that made it so wonderful.
Sure. I got a little buzz on in your question, Ann. I don't know if that's your end or my end, but I think what you said is to offer a little bit of detail on research regarding things like the weather. And is that correct?
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, so, okay. So of course, Forbes, one of the great parts of the story is his great primary sources, right? And Robert Bennett Forbes has all of his papers are at the Mass Historical Society. And the one thing about Forbes is not only was he a person of action, he also wrote like crazy. He was a prolific writer, kept diaries, kept logbooks, wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, wrote his own his autobiography. Don't mean to be redundant, his own autobiography. And so he does lots of weather stuff, right, in his logbooks. Particularly during the voyage time, no question about that. But also he does it when he goes overseas as well. So that's one source for that. And then a good source, I don't consider them really primary sources, but a good source are newspapers of the day. So London Times has good weather. The New York papers all have good weather, kinds of stories in them. And then lots of the letters from, like, let's say, Father Matthew to Trevelyan talk about how bad that winter was in late 1846 into 1847. The howling winds, the snow, that was one of the worst winters in Ireland ever, was that winter of 46 and 47, which, I could almost feel it as these people were being evicted from their homes and forced to walk the countryside. So, I try to put as much of that together as I can to build a narrative.
Thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
It does. Thanks.
Linda, I think I saw your digital hand earlier.
Okay, just a little bit of a quick personal story. In the late 70s and the early 80s, I worked in an office building in East Milton Square, just a short distance from the Forbes mansion, because he's from Milton. And the name Forbes is everywhere in Milton.
Yep.
Forbes Road is a main drag, and the Forbes Mansion and the Forbes Museum, which I never visited. And it's just, thinking back, I had such an incorrect impression of Mr. Forbes. I had gathered just from, lore that he was obviously wealthy, that he was a sea captain. So I presumed that he was an entrepreneur, but sort of a Boston Brahmin, above it all, who made his living at the expense of all these little minions running around. And I just couldn't have been more wrong in my impression of him. He was such a good guy. I wish I had visited the Forbes Museum when I had the chance. I
I
must
think
go to
that's right.
Milton and do it.
Yeah, it's a great place. They were very supportive of this effort. I've been over there a few times as part of this, and the staff there is terrific too. So worth going. But I think you're right. His wife's family really is the family that from where the money comes from, and even his mother's side. In fact, his mother's side really helps him get started, just in terms of his initial job, right? But Forbes is really a self-made man, I would call him. He does, after the Panic of 1837, he goes broke. He and Rose are completely broke, and he earns it all back. Now, he earns it all back in the very, becoming controversial at the time, opium trade. It's legal at that time, but China is getting very, very concerned about the number of people that are addicted to opium, right? And so there's a little bit of resentment to the West as to bringing this business to China, and eventually it's outlawed by China. But you always judge people by what happens in the day, by the day around them. And I would say Forbes is a very admirable guy, an admirable character. I think he goes out of his way to, like, even when he's training these the sailors for the ship, I think he goes out of his way to be a mentor to them. I think he goes out of his way to be fair on how the food is going to be distributed, all of that. So, yeah, I think you're right.
Great. And I'll make sure I get to everyone who has their little digital hand, but I think I saw George, you waving earlier. So go ahead.
I looked at this from a slightly different direction. And I kept marveling at the comparison between the way people, governments, and the social fabric operated at that point in history and what's going on today, where we have a pandemic instead of a famine, where our Senate has failed just as much as the British legislature, the British administration failed for them. And the solutions that, although they're noble, really should have happened in a different fashion. And I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that, but I was struck by the comparison.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, so if you look at, you're saying there's a real contrast. I think if you look at what happens in the famine, so the United States government, if you will, helps out in, I would say, kind of a minimal way. And they do it by this, they do it with the decommissioning of the warships. Congress does approve that. And with this leadership, I'd say, from President Polk, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, a couple others, in requesting, not mandating, but requesting the different towns and cities and communities across the United States to set up Irish relief committees, which they do. But the real, I think the real help in this period comes from the people of the United States. It becomes what we would call today a public-private partnership, where you have, people from all walks of life, which was remarkable, all geographic locations, all occupations, all religions, and helping out and for the most part contributing food that they would either have to grow or shoot or whatever, and for their families, and then contributing part of that to the Irish. So it was this amazing groundswell, I would say, among the American people that gets this done. It's the same public-private partnership that we've used since then. This is why I think this is such a great story and sets a foundation for the country in general. It's the same public-private partnership we use in our contributions today, whether they're domestic contributions or international contributions. So the United States government gives a percentage of money through its taxpayers, through us, but more money is donated individually by Americans through their churches or through their NGOs or through other charities, through private charities, through their workplaces, foundations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that kind of public-private partnership is established with this Jamestown mission. So the pandemic, I think, is a little different in a couple. Well, first of all, I think we did have a lot of public-private partnership, particularly in the development of the vaccine, but also in other areas too. You had a lot of people, individual people, helping wherever they could in terms of helping restaurants, buying gift cards at restaurants, or contributing food to food pantries, or bringing meals to hospital workers and things of that nature. It's always about the food. That's a big part of this. It was a big part of it in 1847, and it's a big part of this pandemic. And so I would say, when you look at it, I don't think it's been handled perfectly, but I think it is. We keep saying it's an unprecedented time. And I think to worldwide, like you're looking at the United States, but if you look worldwide, different countries have tried it different ways, with some success, less success, more success, whatever. So I see some comparisons, but not total comparisons between the two. I think the British, with this food situation, could have developed these soup kitchens much more quickly and gotten the food to people. So we're not talking about a disease that makes people ill. We're talking about people who simply need foodstuffs, And the British did there for a really long time, before that process begins. Now, ultimately, the British do end up setting up these soup kitchens in Ireland and feeding about 3 million Irish. But it's really late in the game. It's too little, too late. It's an extraordinary number of people that are getting fed, particularly in a country with, at that time, almost no interior roads. Very hard to get stuff to the interior as opposed to the ports. So eventually they do, I think, accomplish something pretty dramatic, the British, but it just takes a long time to get there through the bureaucracy. So I think that's what if there's a crime in the British, but in addition to the general bigotry towards the Irish, which is a huge issue, and their huge anti-Catholicism feelings at the time, their overall bureaucratic structure really prevents them from supplying the Irish. I think the ironic thing is the United States at that time, the people of the United States kind of cut through any bureaucracy, not that there's as much in 1847, and make those contributions directly, those food contributions directly.
Steve, before we go on, we're breaking up a little bit. Sometimes it helps if everybody mutes themselves. Sometimes the connection helps, right, Sarah? If everybody's muted, if you're not asking a question. So if you're not muted, huh?
I'm not sure, but it's worth a shot.
Yeah, sometimes that helps. So if you're not muted, there we go.
So I apologize, Margaret, if I didn't see you waving earlier. I wasn't sure if you were raising your hand or resting. So why don't you go ahead?
Yeah.
This is for Steve. Why did he decide? Why did Captain Bennett Forbes decide to sell opium? He didn't get it in the United States. He must have bought it from some middleman and repackaged it. I know it was legal, but that doesn't make it right.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you say it now, you're right. It doesn't. But at the time, it was a fairly common thing. There were lots of opium sales houses, and it was a relatively easy way to make money. There's no question about that. When I say easy, I don't mean you still had to sail thousands of miles and you had to run ships and you had to do that. But for the most part, you had kind of a willing customer base, if I could put it that way, in China and in Southeast Asia in general. It was very, very common and very, very popular. So, Forbes did other things. They transported lots of mercantile kinds of supplies and those things. But when he goes broke, that 1838, 1840 period, when he goes to China, he goes there precisely because he believes he can build his wealth back and make the kind of money that he needs to make, or that he feels like he should make after where he was. And that's the quickest way to do it. Not saying it's the most admirable thing. And of course, again, looking at it from 2020, you'd probably say no, but
It's interesting.
Marijuana is very legal now, and I don't know where we're going. So that
there was recently a lecture on opium from the Salem, the Peabody Essex Museum. And the interesting thing that the Chinese say about the opium crisis was that it wasn't a crisis for them until tobacco was introduced to China. And then it became for them a crisis, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. That is interesting.
We got a hand down the bottom there. The Taylors.
Yes. Am I off?
You are.
Okay. I have a basic question. Why were the Irish living only on potatoes? Didn't they have anything else for food?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because I did want to get back to it. So, part of the issue in Ireland, and it goes back to the anti-Catholicism from the British that had been happening since 1695, William of Orange and Oliver Cromwell and all that, is that the land the Irish worked in, and they did not own, most Irish did not own land. They were working land that absentee British landlords worked. And so as these laws got passed, these anti-Catholic laws got passed, more and more, the land that the Irish got to work was sliced up into smaller and smaller parcels. And really the one product that provides enough yield to feed a family of 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, because the Irish birth rate continued to grow pre-famine. The potato was one of those products that provided that yield and would provide enough left over that you could sell some and maybe buy a pig or buy a mule or buy a wagon, any of those kinds of things. So yes, they ate other things. They ate other grains and they ate, pork and those, and maybe you buy a cattle. But oftentimes it was the potato that really, was the lifeblood. When Trevelyan said, what hope is there for a nation that lives on potatoes? For the Irish, right? The potato sustained health, it sustained vitality, it sustained economic well-being, and it sustained life itself. I mean, that's what it was. When there was a great, I talk about this in the book a little bit, when there was a really strong potato crop, it was more than the sustenance part that the Irish celebrated. It was almost a psychological thing that, wow, we're happy. I won't say happy, there was very little happiness in this period of time in Ireland, but let's say contentment. And when there was a poor potato crop, that's where you get quotes like, Ireland is generally blessed by God, but cursed by man. There's issues with the potato crop. We don't have enough land. We need more more of a crop to grow. So it was a psychological thing either way with the potato crop. And so, yeah, they ate other things, but for the most part, the potato was the foundation of that. And that's one of the things Trevelyan and the British are kind of upset about, because Ireland, think about where we are, it's 1846, 1847. It's really the Industrial Revolution time in England, particularly in London and some of the other cities, but we'll stay with London. And the British want the Irish, the British view them as backward. They're a little bit embarrassed by the Irish. There's no question about that. And they want the Irish to become more modern. This is like, what is this in the British Empire? We have this backward country, you know, where these peasants farm potatoes. And so that's one of the resentment parts that Trevelyan and other people in Lord John Russell's government have towards the Irish. Part of their, you know, I'd say delay in responding is that the Irish really didn't deserve the help. They put themselves in this kind of situation by not, you know, diversifying their crop base and figuring out other ways to sustain themselves. So that's the undercurrent that runs through a lot of the delay.
Thank you.
Great. Nancy and or Gresh, I think you were next.
Yes, thank you. Steve, would you talk about two things? One, what's a typical day for you as a researcher? I kind of think of you as going into a library and spending days and weeks. And I think of Churchill, he had all these minions who did the research, and then he sat down and, you know, gave the prose. So I'm wondering, do you have a lot of minions working for you? And the second part of that is a little different. If this were the times were such that with this blight, were none of the scientists interested in how they might overcome the blight? What actually caused the blight to go away? Just the passage of time?
Yeah, so two very disparate questions. Let me take them in order. One is, I don't have a lot of minions. I have no minions at all. I do have. My niece has helped me research in a couple of spots in previous books, and I have the daughter of a very good friend who's really interested in history that's helped me do some research on this book. So I kind of direct her and give her a little chunk and say, go take a look at this. So that's how that happens. But there's no real minions. If you saw my filing system here, which is right behind me, you would see that the research is right here. So I like doing my own research. I love the research part of this process as much as I love the writing almost. Two different processes, very different, but I do like the research, and it gives me a real hands-on, tactile sense when I'm reading documents from, you know, 1847, 1848, when I'm reading Forbes' letters, those kinds of things. So I like being involved in the research. So that's, I think, the answer to your first question. Second is, yeah, so the blight, you know, it's a fungus. That's what it is. It attacks the roots of the potato, and it attacks the shoots of the potato, and it has the potential to kill them very, very quickly. There's very minimal, although it's just starting, I think is a good way to put it, but there's very minimal kind of scientific knowledge or scientific activity as a way to prevent this. There's lots of praying that goes on in Ireland. I mean, that's the other thing that the British kind of resent the Irish for praying too much, relying too much on priests and on God and that kind of thing. And so you get a lot of that in some of the communications and some of the stories that get told by Father Matthew. But yeah, it's the passage of time. There's this almost this collective holding of breath as the crop blooms, that it'll flourish. In fact, in the summer of 1846, the crop initially flourishes. Father Matthew says on his way, he's going from Cork, I think he's going from Cork to Dublin, and he talks about the first emergence of the potato plants and how beautiful they look and how they flourish. And 2.5 weeks later, he's coming back and he sees them turning black. So it's just devastating. It's just devastating at that point. We live in a country like now, sometimes there's these comparisons as we just did about now and then, but think about today, we live in a country with this unbelievable supply chain, which is a phrase, of course, not used in 1847, but we have this unbelievable supply chain such that, for the first first couple of weeks of the pandemic, we were missing some toilet paper. Every once in a while, you go into the store and there's not your exact McCormick spice that you're looking for. There is those kinds of issues. But think about, for the most part, we've had this pandemic when a lot of the economy has been shut down, but the supply chain works. And in Ireland, the supply chain didn't really exist, number one. And number two, the parts of it that did exist or that did work were rudimentary. So this lack of a network of roads in the interior, even when the crop was good, right? You had to get some of that crop to other people. It was very difficult to do that. And now you're in a situation where the crop's terrible and the weather is awful. So roads are impassable. There's ice, there's ruts, there's snow drifts. You're trying to get a mule to move your cart. It's just, talk about a hard life. I will say it was a hard life.
Martha, did you have a question?
I did. We talk about the famine and the Catholics and the feeling about that, but I've discovered that my ancestors, my great-grandfather was a small child, was brought over to the United States by his grandmother and his uncle. They were Presbyterians, but they were farmers in Ireland, in the Londonderry area. Have you run into that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you speak a little about?
Sure. So they were, speak a little bit about what? I didn't quite hear the end of that.
About what happened with the Protestants that were there. Were they as impacted as much as the Catholics? I mean, they were all farmers, so.
Sure. Oh yes. Of course. Yes. No, they absolutely were impacted as much. I only use the Catholic, the kind of anti-Catholicism piece to sort of explain the British response. So yeah, no, of course, there's Protestant farmers, particularly heading more towards the north, right? That's the break eventually when Irish independence occurs. So absolutely, yes, they were in that same situation. But maybe in some cases, if they own their own land or worked a piece of land that might have been a little larger, they could grow things other than potatoes. That would be the only exception if that was possible. But still, yes, many Protestants, I think, suffered as well, who were farmers, particularly tenant farmers.
Mary, I've seen you've been waiting very patiently there down the bottom with your digital hand. Go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Mary? Okay. Yeah, thank you. I read in your book, and I've heard in other places that during the famine, there was enough food exported out of Ireland to probably alleviate a lot of the problem. And I just, I'm trying to get over the British thing, but how could that be?
Yeah, so your point and your your comment is essentially correct. Now, there may have been some issues, there might have been some starvation, but basically you're right. So think of this: Ireland is part of the United Kingdom at the time, it's part of Great Britain, and the British were very, very concerned about disrupting their markets, their overseas markets, the markets that they sold to. And so the non-potato crops, and this is some questions that we've gotten about non-potatoes, the non-potato grains, and particularly corn, oat, barley, those sorts of things that were grown in Ireland, in large part, and this is one of the reasons one of the things the British were guilty of, because they didn't respond quickly enough. The British were exporting those grains from Ireland as part of their normal course of commerce and doing business, even in the midst of the famine. So those were British exports. They were Irish exports, but those were British exports, one and the same. And so one of the real, I would say, terrible images that the Irish held onto for a very long time, and I think justifiably so, is that after so many of them were evicted for not being able to pay their rent, wandering the countryside, and one of the images that seared into their brains was, as they're wandering the countryside, starving, freezing, carts would roll by, filled with food, guarded by British soldiers on their way to ports for export. So that's a very, very that was a very, very common thing, particularly, I'll say, early in the famine. So when I say early, I mean all the way into 1847, well into 1847, when the British finally say, we need to take some action here. So this kind of laissez-faire attitude that we don't want to disrupt corn markets. There could be big issues with the British economy if we do that. And so, yeah, on the ground, what that looks like is food being exported while Irish people are wandering the countryside in the middle of winter, starving.
Nancy? Unmute yourself. Unmute. There you go.
The other thing that really bothered me was the people who were being evicted from their homes. They came in and they tore the house down. Why was that necessary? Why couldn't they just remove the people? Why did they feel the landlord only had to tear it down?
Because Nancy, what would happen is, so what would happen is the people would go back and squat, if you will. So that was the concern. So they tore down the buildings so that people wouldn't go back and live on that land. So what you often saw was, even after they tore down the buildings, those who had been evicted or others who had come upon a pile of rubble or a pile of debris would kind of do their best to burrow in there and survive. So the reason that those buildings were destroyed, and they weren't, these aren't big buildings, these are cabins and in some cases even mud huts, but maybe glorified mud huts. But they didn't want those tenants who had been evicted to remain on the property. That simple.
Okay. Any other questions, anyone? Yeah, Gresh, go ahead.
Steve, how about De Valera? I wasn't aware that Ireland was neutral in World War II, and that Churchill had given him the opportunity to become independent, the whole of Ireland, in exchange to come in and be on the British side. And I just wonder, is De Valera the prime minister or president or whoever, what they call their guy in chief? Was he proto-fascist himself?
Yeah, I'm not getting who you're talking about. I'm getting this little breakup when you're saying
He's asking about Eamon
prime
de
minister
Valera.
or
The De Valera in World War II.
okay. It's so what? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Sorry. Now I got it.
Okay.
Well, so that's the big issue with the, one of the long time implications of the famine, right, is how it affects Ireland, right? Is the legacy of this famine is huge. So it affects Ireland, I think, during the independence of the 1920s. It affects Ireland during the Troubles in the 70s and the 80s. The famine is at the bedrock of that. And I think the famine is at the bedrock of what happens during the Second World War as well. So Ireland is one of 7 countries that remains neutral during World War II. Yemen is one, Chad is one. There's a very, very tiny number of countries that remain neutral during the Second World War. And even when Churchill asks the government of Ireland to join with the British, they do not. And in fact, they do provide havens for Nazis, particularly early in the war and even later in the war, but particularly early in the war. This gets the Irish people in many ways very upset because they are certainly not fascists. They are probably very strongly anti-Hitler. And it gets them even more upset after December 7th of 1941, because now their battle with England becomes a battle with the United States, which they do not want. They are fully supportive of the United States. Again, I think a legacy of this effort, this American effort during the famine years. They're very supportive. They have a strong relationship with the United States. They always have. And so this kind of official Irish stance, de Valera's stance, as you call it, produces a lot of conflict in Ireland. So much so that members of the Irish Defense Force, a lot of them, defect, for lack of a better word, and go to fight for the British in their fight against the Nazis. Those members of the Irish Defense Force who do that really fear for their safety when they come home. They feel like they're going to be tried and imprisoned for treason. And what they end up doing is finally in 2012, all of those people get pardoned, many posthumously, but they get pardoned for that situation, for the going to fight, and in some cases heroically on the Allied side. But keep in mind that early in the war, Ireland would not even let British ships that were fleeing from Nazi U-boats dock at Irish ports. That's how strong the bitterness was between Ireland and in England at that time. Even when Churchill says, please join us, let's put our differences aside, de Valera says no. So I don't think he's necessarily pro-fascist. I think it's this legacy that even during the Second World War, the official Irish government can't get past.
Any other questions, anyone? I have a couple of other topics for you, Steve, that maybe we can talk about. First of all, you're very generous with getting all the food and sending the ships to Ireland. But now once the immigrants start coming to us, it seems like that generosity has shifted. Can you kind of talk about what changed that feeling once all the immigrants started coming from Ireland?
Yeah, so probably a way to start is, why at this moment in time did Americans respond so favorably to this effort to begin with, right? So that's maybe a way to look at this. It's an unprecedented thing. There's never been a time before when the people of one country had helped the people to another country on this kind of a grand scale. Countries went to war with each other. They occasionally traded with each other, but they never did this in this massive altruistic manner. And I think a lot of things come together in the United States in this 1846, 1847 timeframe that caused this, right? So one, the Mexican War. There's a lot of angst, particularly in the Northeast, about the Mexican War. It's this war that a lot of Northeast abolitionists particularly see as a war to expand slavery, if we acquire Texas, et cetera, et cetera. This is a way, this Irish assistance, particularly in the Northeast, one of the ways to kind of assuage that guilt. That's happening. That's number one. Number two, America's in the midst of lots of reform efforts right smack in the middle of 1846 and 1847. Prison reform, mental health reform, women's suffrage is underway, abolitionists, that's underway, education reform, all of that is underway. And I think there's this feeling that you're trying to help people here in the United States, you're trying to make these efforts in these areas, mental health, education, things like that. It's our duty to kind of help people beyond our borders as well. Three, speaking of Protestants, the Second Great Awakening is going on. The Protestant renewal movement is happening in the United States right in 1846, 1847. And so I think the churches, and keep this in mind, churches of all denominations, you might expect Catholic churches to help with this Irish relief effort, but I'm talking, Quakers, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, Unitarians, Jews, large numbers of churches, temples, religions help in this effort. And so that I think is part of the Great Awakening. And then the last part of it is 1846. It is the year of decision in the United States. It's when people decide they're going to head west. It's the whole manifest destiny. The first time manifest destiny was used was in 1846, and people headed west. And this is even just a couple of years before the gold rush, but they headed west in great numbers. And there's this feeling among Americans, lots of Americans, that we are a land of abundance. We have all of these navigable rivers. We have all of this arable land. We have oceans, teeming with fish on our coasts, and that we have an obligation to share it with others, that there's that piece, that we have an obligation to do that. So that perfect storm, I think, in 46, 47, a little bit of 48, leads to the American effort to help the Irish. So now it's a different situation when it's one thing to help Irish across the sea. It's another thing, and I'll use Boston as an example. It's another thing when you have thousands and thousands of starving, and in many cases sick Irish coming to your shores. So let's use Boston, which, of course, thousands came here. In 1847, Boston was a city of 115,000 people. They had 37,000 Irish immigrants come to Boston during that year. So the city is, overrun by destitute Irish immigrants, has a very, very difficult time in a closed Boston society handling that influx, and geographically has very, very little room to put them. One of the reasons that the Back Bay, the great filling of the Back Bay project, gets underway 10 years later is because the wealthy people of Boston needed a place to settle. And the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts needed a place for these wealthy people to go, rather than fleeing the city, for them to go, to sort of be a little bit distant from these Irish peasants who at that point had completely inundated the north end of Boston. So all of that gets tied together. And so I think it's just like anything. It's one thing to help out people who are a distance away. It's another thing about all those people to come. And I think that's repeated in a lot of other cities as well. And they face that. So they face that kind of intense discrimination, including the anti-Catholic discrimination. I've done a lot of work on the Italians, right? My heritage. And Italians were discriminated against in a horrendous way when they came here. But I think one of the ways they were not discriminated against was the anti-Catholic piece. The Irish kind of clear the way for that, for other nationalities. But the Irish face severe anti-Catholicism issues when they come here.
Then maybe you can talk about the long-term impact between the British and the Irish, and then also the impact of the British United States efforts when we got into this famine relief. What were the long-term impact from both of those relations, from the Irish and from the United States point of view.
Yeah, so I mean, I touched a little bit on the Irish-British, and I want to say that Irish-British rift, if you will, right? It comes right up till about the turn of the century. I mean, this century, the 21st century. You know, in 1999, and I think you might have had this somewhere in your notes to me, Joan, but in 1999, an Irish historian says that the Great Famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table since the mid-19th century. So we're talking 150 years later, he's making that comment. And I think it stems into the new century as well. Just anecdotally, when I was in Ireland in 2009 first, and we had rented like one of those big kind of vans, pop-up vans with a driver. There was several of us, and we were in the south, and then we went into Northern Ireland and saw Belfast and saw the uprising and you know, all of that. And one day we came out of a hotel, and the side mirror was smashed. And our driver, who's from the southern part of Ireland, starts screaming and saying, you know, they looked at our license plate, they saw we from the south, and you know, here we are up in Belfast, and this is still what happens here. And so it's an anecdotal thing, but I do think that kind of long-term rift between Ireland and England lasts well right into at least the 2000s. And yeah, it manifests itself, like I said, the independence movement of the 1920s. It's the famine that's at the bottom of that. The World War II issues we just talked about, I think it's the famine, the troubles in the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s. You know, it's the famine that's at the bottom of that. Now, I said earlier, this British Ireland clash, which is mainly a religious clash, goes back to 1695 and earlier, but it's that William of Orange and Oliver Cromwell. But I mean, I think the famine really solidifies it and really kind of sets that tone for the next century and a half. The United States, so Ireland's relationship with the United States has been almost the completely opposite. It's been extremely good, extremely strong. It's what bothers the Irish so much after Pearl Harbor, by the way. It's what causes a lot of the members of the Irish Defense Force to defect, is the attack on Pearl Harbor, saying they're friends with the United States. So that's a big issue, and it's continued strong, I think, to this day. And one of the other things that connection is Native Americans to the Irish government. So the Choctaw Indians, if you read the book, you'll know that the Choctaw Indians, the Indians who were part of the Trail of Tears in 1831, the Choctaws contribute money to the Irish. The Irish never forgot that. They have very strong bonds with the Choctaw tribe. In 1995, Mary Robinson, who's the president of Ireland at the time, you know, becomes a member of the Choctaw Council of Elders, the first woman to ever sit on their Council of Elders.
And isn't there
there's
memorial?
that very strong relationship.
There's a memorial in Ireland for the Choctaws
Yes,
too, right?
there is. For the Choctaw, yes,
Yep.
there is. Yes, there is. And so that continues. And then I guess the last part of your question is the relationship between the United States and Britain. So it's interesting during the famine itself. There's lots of talk, because don't forget, we're in the midst of discussions with the English about Oregon territory, right smack in 1846, 1847, 1848. That's a British possession, Oregon, in the United States is in discussions on accessing that land. And so there's lots of concern in Congress during the debates about this. If we help the Irish, what is that going to do for our relationship with England? Is it possible that could bring us, not only could that embarrass the British in their own backyard, is it possible there could be some hostilities? And how sensitive is this while we're trying to do this Oregon thing? So a lot of that is underway too. But for the most part, I would say after about 1870, because the The United States has some real issues with Britain during the Civil War for helping the Confederates and supplying the Confederates and helping the Confederates build ships. So real issues there, like almost to the brink of war with Britain. But after about the 1870s, mid 1870s, the United States relationship with Britain is also very good, very good.
Awesome.
Mary, I saw your hand up again down there. Go.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Rose. It
Mm.
really struck me that, you know, here's this poor woman who's lost 2 children, and that can wreak incredible emotional havoc on her, let alone the, you know, any physical effects. And her husband walks up to her and says, "Rose, I'm going to China. I'm going to be gone a couple of years. I hope that's okay." And I'm thinking, I know you've looked at correspondence between the two. I mean, obviously Rose survived.
Yeah,
But,
yeah,
I
lots
mean,
of them.
Can you flesh out a little bit more about her and their relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I loved Rose as a character. I mean, she, as you know, as a person, she went through so much, as you say. By the way, she ends up ultimately she loses 4 children. You know, like later in the narrative, I point out that after the fact. But yes, you're right. The 2 most devastating were the 2 she loses right shortly after their marriage. They're married in 1834. She loses a child in 1835. In 1836, and then in 1837, Bennett is born. You know, so when Robert Bennett Forbes goes to China, he's only 8 months old, and you know, there's concern on both of their parts. Like, do we want to be apart here? It's a miracle that he's here. Our little son is here, and but I think Rose, man, she struggles a lot during it. When you read some of these letters, at one point, you know, she is depressed. She's in the midst of depression. She wants to sleep the sleep from which there is no waking, she writes to Robert Bennett Forbes. And, you know, again, remember the time, you know, it's 1847. There's no Sigmund Freud's, there's no psychiatrist, just, you know, that kind of thing. So a couple of times, you know, Forbes, I think, comes across as a little insensitive when he says, you know, hey, just get better. You know, there's a couple letters where he says, you know, why do you keep sending me these letters about how despondent you are? Don't you know how tough this is on me, you know, to get these kind of letters, that sort of thing. And I think, you know, when at first glance, when you read them, you're like, wow, how insensitive is that? But it's prior to the things we know today, right? And so, but I think one of the things about Rose is she rallies too. She does rally. So she relies on friendships here. You know, she's thrilled that she has Bennett and that Bennett's healthy. And so she does improve. I mean, the tone of these letters is very different by, you know, let's say late 1839, early 1840, before Forbes gets home, than it was when Forbes left. When Forbes left, she is despondent. And then, as I said earlier, when he gets back, he is back in 1840, does a quick trip to Britain for like a couple of months, and then he's home till 1847. And I think Rose has a lot to do with that. You know, like, it's time for you to stay home. It's time for us to try to build our family, which they do. And so from 1840, from the beginning of 1841 until March of 1847, when the Jamestown departs, he's home. That's the longest block that he's home, period, up till that point, you know.
George, did you have a question?
No, not really a question so much as a comment. At the beginning of
George is frozen.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to make sure that wasn't me. George
Yeah.
is frozen.
George is frozen.
Okay.
Maybe he'll come back.
Okay. Okay.
Is there any, maybe we'll get George back, but my last two thoughts are, is there any part of the book that we haven't talked about that you're anxious to share with us? And do you have another book in the works that we can look forward to?
So the first part, I mean, no, I think we've covered a lot, man. This is, I guess the thing that continued to amaze me about this effort on the part of the United States people was how hard it was to make these contributions of food. Today we make contributions, we write a check, we go to the, we use our credit card online, maybe we donate to the food pantry, all great. I'm not, that's how I do it. So all great. But when you think about, you grew food, you had to grow food or shoot food, pack it up into burlap sacks, put it into kegs, put it on, small boats that would go down the Ohio River, the Erie Canal, put it on trains. And then that went to bigger ports like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore and load them onto ships. It's remarkable that always made me, it always amazed me that the American people came through in that way, when it was very hard to make a donation of food. So I think that's one of the things that maybe we didn't stress enough that I found during this research, and these letters from all different walks of life, these trappers and farmers, out in the frontier at that time being like Detroit, that Detroit area, or really a little bit of Wisconsin, that kind of thing. School children made contributions, prisoners made contributions, slave churches in the South made contributions. So that whole thing, as I kind of unraveled that research, I feel like maybe it's good to emphasize that a little bit, towards the end of this discussion.
And
then your
great,
second.
I just want to say there's a
Sorry.
great quote I'd like to read before, we talk about hopefully a new book. The quote is, the precedent set by America's response to the Irish famine continues to guide our international charitable efforts almost 175 years later. I think that's great. We were the beginning, and look,
Yeah.
kind of set the precedent for the whole world.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, the subtitle of the book, it talks about, in America's first humanitarian mission. It's really the world's first humanitarian mission on that kind of a scale. So I think you're absolutely right. So part 2 is there will be a Puleo book 8. That's good.
Yay!
Sign the deal. Yes, thank you very much. Sign the deal over the summer, which is, a blessing in the midst of everything, so I consider myself very fortunate. I can't tell you the topic yet. I'm sorry. I need to hold off on that for a little while. It is narrative history, so that, that remains the same.
Will it be
And
next
I'm
year?
very
Will it be
excited
out
about
next
it.
year?
No. As a matter of fact, so my manuscript is not even due. I say not even due, even though it feels closer than it's going to sound to you. My manuscript is due November 1st of 2022, which is good because the research is a bear for this book, a lot of research in this book. And then I think the book will be out. There hasn't been a decision. It'll either be out in the fall of 2023 or the spring, March of 2024. I think that it's with St. Martin's Press, my current publisher. So they'll make that decision, and I think they'll make it shortly. So as soon as I'm able to kind of tell a little bit more, I will. If you're on my mailing list, and if you Joan or Sarah or Sue or any of these folks, my email is spuleo@aol.com. Send me an email and say, I'd like to be on your mailing list. I do about 3 of these or 4 of these mailings a year. So I'm not going to inundate you every day or anything like that. And when I'm able to tell you more, you'll be among the first several thousand people to know.
We always enjoy your books, and we always enjoy your commentary. You write stories so well. You do make history come alive in a really great way. We thank you for that.
Definitely. And as you can imagine from
Thank
your
you.
writing and speaking style, Steve, you do a wonderful newsletter. I always look forward to them.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sarah,
very
that's
much.
great.
It's
I
been
spent a lot
great.
of time on those.
I echo
Okay.
all of that.
Sue, back to you. And
Yep.
Steve, thank you again. We've really enjoyed it as always.
Yes, as always,
Thanks,
a
John. Thanks,
terrific
guys.
job. And thank you personally for educating me once again on an area that I knew nothing about. And I now feel I know about it.
Well, you're
So
very
thank you
welcome. I'm
very
glad.
much.
I'm glad.
So thank you all
All right.
for
Thank
coming.
you, guys.
Yes.
Thanks to everybody.
Yep. All right.
Right.
Yay.
Your next
So
date,
the next one, the next one is the Woman's Hour, which is the great fight to win the vote. Wrapping up our study of the women's efforts to get the right to vote. And this is by Elaine Weiss, and we're pleased that she will be joining us on March 23rd, which is the next session of the book group. So we look forward to seeing her then. We look forward to seeing all of you then. And thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you.
thanks again, everybody. Sarah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Steve,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much. Thanks, guys.
Sue, everybody.
Good night.
Stay
everyone.
healthy.
Thank you.
See you in March.
Right.
Bye,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great job as always. Terrific.
Bye,
Yeah.
Sue.
Bye-bye.
Steve. Thank you. Bye, Sarah.
All right.